I'm Lindy James. I'm part of the WITS LCT Hub, and I've just finished my MDiss in education, and Lee was my supervisor. So that's been a real journey and a real privilege. I trained as a foundation-based teacher, which is an elementary school teacher, grade R or pre-primary to grade 3, and I spent about 12 years in that space. And then I moved into more teacher education, teacher training, and I'm currently working in teacher education in a different country, Namibia, and in South Africa. But my passion is in literacy teaching and teaching of reading and phonics, and that will come through a little bit in this presentation today. So the title of my presentation is Using Semantics to Assess How Students' Understanding of Practice Changes Over Time. And I would really welcome anyone's input as I go ahead. All right, here we go. Why is this not moving? There we go. All right, so in whatever field you're in, whether you're in teacher education, whatever it may be, we want to see a shift between first year and final year. We want to prepare them for the world of work. We want them to develop a knowledge base and to be able to use that knowledge so that when they're in the field working in whatever field they're in, they can do so with that conceptual knowledge that they can draw from and bring to bear on practice, as it were. So how then do we track the uptake of student learning? And that was something that was really personally interesting to me, because I felt that there was a lot that I've missed out on in my own training, and I'm very interested in the quality of teacher education. So let me move on. Right, so just to put my study into context, in South Africa, and I think actually in many areas of the world, literacy education, so reading and spelling, is very much in crisis. And there's a lot of different contextual factors that come into play here, but one of those is that there's a lack of knowledge on the part of teachers. So it's the whole idea that there's issue of coherence in teacher practice, and that they don't necessarily have those conceptual tools that they need. And this has resulted in a lack of adequate reading pedagogies. Okay, how we are teaching reading, how we understand reading development. And so one of the responses to this needs to be an urgent production of teachers of a high quality, so that we can then bridge this gap and solve this problem. So that's the context of my study. So what I'm saying is that future teachers need to do more than replicate ineffective practices. And if you go into a classroom and you observe what a teacher's doing, but you don't have the critical sensibilities to evaluate and understand the why of practice, then you might actually end up just going into the classroom yourself one day and copy and paste the same ineffective practices. We want responsive, reflective practitioners, and that's what we want to develop through their teacher education journey. Right, so it's not that I don't believe that you can be a born teacher and that you can be predisposed to loving children. But I also firmly believe that teaching is a natural work, that it's a knowledge practice, and that from first year to final year, as I said before, there should be a shift, and there should be an increasingly specialized gaze that is developed throughout that time when you are engaging in your studies. And so my study looks at that. It looks at studying change over time. Now, how do we study change over time? You can do a longitudinal study, which is not what I've done, where you compare the same group. So you would take a specific group of students in their first year, perhaps, and you'd follow their journey. And then by the time they get to fourth year, you could see how their knowledge and their understanding has progressed. And what I've done is a cross-sectional study comparing different groups at the same time, but I'll get into that in a minute. But how do we make this change explicit? How do we reveal this change? And to do that, I recruited tools from the semantics dimension of LCT. So let's quickly move forward. Right, so I presume that a lot of people have a good working knowledge possibly much better than myself.
Lindy, don't
Yes.
don't assume anything. Just gloss as much as you possibly can. So
Okay.
yeah,
Okay,
because
cool.
what happens is that sometimes people think we know, you know, everybody knows the concept, but actually we've all got different ideas in our head. So it's useful to hear what you think they mean.
Okay, thank you. All right. So semantic gravity allows us to explore context dependence. Okay, so it refers to the degree to which meaning relates to its context. In other words, in my particular study, when a student refers to what's happening in that
Oui, tu
particular
vas c'est
lesson,
N3.
oh, is someone there? Sorry. Did someone want to say something? I heard somebody. No? Maybe
No,
it
that
was
was
an accident.
accidental. I muted them too.
Okay, no problem. So when a student, for example, is referring to a specific interaction in a particular lesson, that's far more context dependent than if they are referring to generalized strategies across which are applicable across contexts, for example. And semantic gravity can be weaker or stronger along a continuum of strengths. Okay. And then semantic density allows you to explore complexity of meaning. And of course, as with semantic gravity, it can be weaker or stronger along a continuum of strengths. And I will go into how these manifest in my study. Basically, stronger semantic density is when more meaning is condensed, and then weaker semantic density would be simpler. For example, in my study, an atomistic statement of description, what's happening in the classroom, a very simple, isolated description would be simpler semantic density. Okay, so let me quickly go into the next slide. Okay. So my study, again, looks at, are there differences in the way that first and final year students notice and interpret practice? So what I want to see is if there is an increase in their ability to recruit their conceptual and theoretical knowledge to help them understand practice, the why of practice, from first to final year. Like I said, it was a cross-sectional study. And what I've done is I've taken the first group, which actually is a composite of 3 different institutions. So group 1 was first years from 3 different South African institutions. And group 2 were final year students from the same 3 institutions. Okay. How did I collect my data? Where did my data come from? Who were my participants? I've already explained that. And the data came from the teacher choices in action module. So teacher choices in action, let me go forward and then I'll go backwards. Right. So teacher choices in action is a module that came about as a response to the COVID pandemic, where teachers in training could not go and do their teaching practice in schools because obviously there were restrictions, but they still needed to learn from practice. And so teacher educators from around the country, including Professor Lee, they came together and they developed a module which made explicit or tried to make explicit the reasons for practice. So what they did was they had 250 lessons recorded, which was put onto a database. And then they also had a module which went into best practice and the reasons for practice. And what they did was they asked students to choose from the 250 lessons which are online. And when they've chosen a lesson, they need to watch the lesson and then describe the lesson, explain why the teacher was doing what they were doing in the lesson, and also to appraise the lesson, as it were. What do they think of the lesson? Are there any improvements that they'd like to make, and so forth? So, and those reports that are written about the lesson are called lesson observation reports. And those are integral to my study because that's where the data came from those lesson observation reports that students wrote about these recorded lessons. Now, just to go back, so the participants were self-selecting in that I knew I needed a cohort of first year students from the 3 universities, and I knew I needed a cohort of the 4th years from the 3 universities, but I selected a specific lesson. Now, you know about my passion for reading and phonics and all those things. So I wanted a lesson that was focused explicitly on the teaching of reading. And I'm not talking about a perfect lesson here, just a lesson which the goal was to immerse learners in reading. And so I selected a particular lesson, and I'll go a little bit more into that. So all of these students watched the very same lesson. All of the first years and all of the 4th years were watching the same lesson. And I wanted to know, what were they seeing in 4th year that is different to what they saw in 1st year? Is there a shift? Are they able to see more in practice than than 1st years? All right, so I keep hearing, no, that doesn't look like it's intentional either. All right, so I'm not going to do a deep dive into reading, but I just wanted to, because it's important for you to know what this lesson was about. So teaching reading is complex, and if you're not in the field, it may look like it's an easy ride, but really, if you really want to be intentional, you need to know what you're doing when you're teaching reading. Now, these are some of the skills that encompass skilled reading, and in this particular lesson, I don't know if you can see my arrow, probably not. Anyway, in this particular lesson that the learners observed, it was dealing
Lindy,
with...
Lindy, we do see your arrow.
Oh, okay. So can you see me flying up above in the top section here? Is this visible? Okay, cool. So for better or for worse, okay, remember, I'm not critiquing the lesson here, but for better or for worse, the lesson focused on word recognition skills. So the mechanics of reading. Yes, they read a book together, but there was very little explicit language comprehension development in the lesson. So they were breaking down the sounds of words, they were focusing on phonics and such. And this kind of very important stuff here in the blue and the green was, for this particular lesson, largely implicit. And that's important to note for a couple of reasons, of which I'll explain now. Okay, so, right. What I did first, remember I had the store of many lesson observation reports, and I needed to make sense of those. So I needed to start breaking them down and to code what I felt I really wanted to look at. So I began with a thematic analysis, and I chose to focus on word recognition, and I called it noticings. In other words, the statements in the lesson observation reports that related to word recognition, because that was where the focus of this lesson was, for better or for worse. Okay. But I also, and I won't be talking about this because it doesn't really deal with what LCT has helped me to reveal, but I did a narrative analysis of the other strands of the rope because it was less explicit in the lesson. Okay, so I did a thematic analysis, and then I went into using LCT, which I will start explaining now. Okay, so what I did, this is just to show you how I did it. I coded in color. It was very interesting to see that a lot of the first years just recounted the actual story in the storybook. So one day there was a little tortoise, and the tortoise went for a picnic, and that wasn't relevant for my study. I didn't, that was not necessary for them to say in the first place. Comprehension is relevant to reading, but it wasn't the focus of the lesson. So I coded it, but for LCT, I focused on the red over here, which is word recognition noticings. And that's where I took things further with LCT. Okay. So
Lindy,
what I,
can I ask
yes. Who's
question?
there?
I have a question.
Yes.
Yes. Hi. So actually, I've read about this project. I think that Lee wrote about it when during COVID or right after COVID, and I see that you have the 3 basic questions that you ask as guiding questions, and I'm just wondering, was the thematic analysis done for? Did you look at all 3 questions, or did you just do the part where it says, "What is the teacher doing?"
So and Lee, you can always jump in here, but how the lesson observation reports are structured is that the learners, the students who are writing them, they were not explicit in breaking down, you know, question 1, I'm answering it. Question 2, I'm answering it. Question 3, I'm answering it. So it was kind of like a conglomeration of all their thinking all together, for better or worse. So I didn't actually, I took each lesson observation report as a whole, and within that, they would have answered all 3. It's a very good question, and I think if their lesson observation reports had been structured for me, I may have decided to look at one particular element. But in general, I looked at it all. I don't know if that helps you. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does, because we have the
Okay, but
evaluative question at the
it
end.
was a very good question, and I think that actually is something that one could look at in another study. Okay, here we go. All right, so what did I do? Let me just, why is it not moving forward? Here we go. Okay, let's have a quick look at the translation device for semantic gravity. Okay, so and I mean, this was really strenuous but very exciting and rewarding process in the research, is how you kind of go backwards and forwards between your data and your translation device, and you work with it and you refine it, and gosh, I'm still actually refining it a little bit as we speak. But a translation device is, I think, really where the magic begins with LCT, for me anyway, and it really started me on this journey of understanding why LCT is so powerful. And what it is, it's a tool to enable dialogue between theory and data. If that is put in a succinct enough way. And so I needed to decide, how am I seeing semantic gravity, the context dependence, how am I seeing it manifest in the portions of observation reports that I'm analyzing. And the more I looked, this is what I saw. So stronger semantic gravity here that I've coded SG++. I said it was when students focused on specific details of the lesson located within a specific point of time and space. Okay, so for example, learning is promoted through the use of sentence starters being offered to ensure that learners know what the task is required. It's very, very much in the moment what is going on. And then here, more generalized aspects about the lesson. So the teacher teaches the word through their phonics. It's less specific, what phonics, how is she doing it? And then techniques, strategies, or protocols was SG minus. So the teacher focuses on how these words are constructed, morphology, and how the way they're pronounced, phonology. And then principles for teaching, so that are applicable across different contexts. Grammar is fundamental if one will be able to understand the usage of language. And I've just used pretty much how they put it. So some of the English grammar is not brilliant, but this comes straight from the data. So that is how I coded for semantic. And what I'm going to show you now is, I mean, you would expect quite a significant, basically what I would expect is that we do see quite strong semantic density because they are focusing on a particular context, a particular lesson. But I would also expect to see that final year teachers start to generalize and to see that how the principles of practice can be used across different contexts. So let's have a look and see. I'm going to show you how the semantic range, this is the semantic range of a first year lesson observation report. So how they move between the specific happenings in the lesson to more generalized principles of practice. Watch this cool trick here. Wait. Ting. Wait, is it going to work? Oh, my trick is not working. Lee, how do I make the trick work where it goes? Oh, there we go. It didn't look very beautiful, but I had a beautiful, what do you call it? Animation, which didn't work. Okay, so you can see here that it's a very small semantic range here. The first year student in this example doesn't discuss any principles of practice. You know, there are some general aspects of the teacher's work that are mentioned, but it's very, very, very strongly tied to the context. So let's have a look at how that is different from a fourth year example. Okay, let me just, Okay, there we go. So here you can see the difference is that although most of it is still quite strongly tied to the context, you can see that there is a larger semantic range here where this fourth year student is able to mention principles for teaching that are applicable across different contexts. So I found that quite interesting. And I'm going to show you the percentages now. So if we look at how many students, the percentage of first and fourth year students who were able to enact, I don't know if I'm using the right word of enact, but who were able to enact a larger range of semantic gravity. So 41% of students in their final year were able to get right up there to semantic. Now I'm going off my jargon is now disappearing. They were able to enact a wider range of semantic gravity and a smaller, but they still 47% of final years who were stuck there, who couldn't get to weaker semantic gravity. Lee, please jump in if I'm bumbling on myself. Okay. All right. But the majority of pre-service teachers in both cohorts were operating within a smaller range of semantic gravity. So let's quickly have a look at...
Can I jump in again and just ask one more question? Sorry, Lindy.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, okay. Because you had Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 3. So were those different teaching units that they were supposed to, or is this something that we're... Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Now, this is where I think the next slide is going to assist you. Okay, so what I realized when I was coding the data, and this is why my translation devices were so challenging, especially for semantic density, is that I started with one simple translation device, and I realized that what I was seeing was that there were different facets of noticing. By that, I mean, sometimes the students were describing practice, sometimes they were interpreting practice, sometimes they were appraising practice. And in fact, what that meant for my study was that I had to really get far more granular, if you like, and divide my translation device into, for semantic density, into a translation device for description, interpretation, and appraisal. So what you're seeing here is slices of, let me just show you, actually, this would be, no, I took it out, Lee, I think. What you're seeing here is, in this particular instance, actually, you know what, I think I'm explaining this wrong. Lee, you might need to jump in. Here, this is one unit of semantic gravity. In other words, in this particular slice, they have enacted SG+. Then they're moving across and they are now enacting SG++. And in this particular unit, they are enacting SG minus. Does that make sense? I think that's how I've structured it here. Lee, am I making sense?
Lindy, yeah, that's exactly what you did. These were just your units of analysis where you said, okay, now they're talking about one thing. You know, what strength of semantic gravity are they working with? Now they've moved on to a different thing.
There we go. So Daniel, sorry that I confused you there, but I'll explain why I confused myself. But basically, in order to plot this, I needed to decide at which point the strength of semantic gravity changed. And so that's one unit and another unit and another unit. I hope that makes sense. Okay, but now I'm going to go on to my translation device. So I decided that I was going
Lindy, sorry, yes. Before you go there, can we go back to, yes, your semantic range? Because I think that there's some really, really fascinating patterns here that, you know, right at when students start, so their first year, that, you know, more than 75%, 3/4 of them are just sticking to the lesson.
Yes, yes, quite right.
and some of them are getting to kind of the strategies that she's using, but only 8% are getting to those principles of teaching.
Yeah.
Where, but it's quite a concern, I think, that by the time that they get to fourth year, just under half in your sample were still, I think you did mention it, but I think it's a point just worth pausing at. That just over half were able to weaken semantic gravity and get to those levels of principles.
And I think that just speaks to, there's a difficulty in shifting and making that connection between theory and practice, which is what I was looking at in the study. So it is a concern. And I think it is an interesting pattern. Have I missed anything else? I'm going to move on. Is that okay? Okay. All right. So I just explained that what I needed to do when I coded was to have a separate translation device for the 3 different facets of noticing, which were what I could identify as describing practice. So, just explaining what is happening, and then interpreting, so the why of practice, and then appraising, so using one's critical sensibilities, or just explaining whether you thought it was a good lesson or not such a good lesson, and then looking at how semantic density manifested within those 3 different categories or facets of noticing. So just in the interest of time, I'm just going to look at the translation device for interpretation. So just to show you what I've done here. So for ST very weak semantic density is really just a description of practice, really. So the student might give a description, but there's no reasons provided for the teacher's actions. There's no sense of the why that action is being implemented or why that action was chosen. Then ST minus would be where the student suggests what the teacher's doing, but it's very everyday. So it's something that perhaps anybody could walk in and talk about or suggest the reasons for. So, for example, in the second bullet there, the teacher is helping the children with the words they're going to come across while reading, so they can manage. But so they can manage what? It's also not very specific. There's no technical terminology. They don't go any deeper. And then a nuanced interpretation, ST plus, would be when some technical terminology is mentioned, but it's not fully elaborated, or perhaps not meaningfully connected to theoretical concepts or strategies. So the teacher does whatever they were doing, because she knows that learners need to know how to decode phonics out of context. So there you can see 2 things happening. There's a little bit of technical terminology there in the word decode, and also there's a little bit of obviously, because of that, there's a bit of connection to theory, but it's not particularly elaborated. And then if you look here, ST++ was technical theorized interpretation. So the student makes use of educational ideas and principles to explain precisely what the teacher is doing. So much more precise, and uses technical terms to pinpoint specific strategies. So breaking things down into their constituent parts a little bit more. For example, the teacher's demonstrations taught learners that there are predictable relationships between sounds and letters, and that this knowledge can be applied to both familiar and unfamiliar words. And this knowledge aids in improving fluency in reading. So you can see that's a lot more complex, a lot more theorized and technical than saying the teacher is helping the children with the words that they're going to come across while reading the story so they can manage. Okay, so that's how I saw semantic density manifesting, particularly with relation to interpreting practice. Okay, I hope you can't hear my cat meowing in the background. Right, let's have a look at how the now I'm getting very okay. Let's have a look. Let's just see if I can make my magic happen? There we go. Okay, so let's have a look at the semantic range of this first year example. Again, you can see they don't reach that level of complexity. So they're very much giving simple, oh, here we can see what I was trying to say there, Daniel. This is what I was trying to get at. Okay, now I understand why I said that. So especially because semantic density, because I had to separate that into different facets of noticing, here you can see that at play in this particular graph. So first they started with an elaborated everyday description, then they moved to a simple description, then they did a generic interpretation, then there was a simple description again. Can you see what I mean by that? So I think that's where I got myself confused. So the semantic gravity was just breaking it up into the different strengths of semantic gravity, and here is actually the different facets of noticing. Otherwise, I couldn't code it properly, if that makes sense. Okay, so you can see there's a very small range here of semantic density in the first year example. And then let's have a look at the final year example. Trying to make the magic happen again. Come on, come on. Okay, all right, let's pretend there's lines connecting these dots here. There we go. All right, so you can see here that this student manages to enact a stronger degree of semantic density. And of course, we don't need to see strong semantic density throughout their lesson observation, because you have to move between the codes. So, but it's good to see that there's a lot more complex thought, a lot more connection to theory happening at the fourth year level. Okay. And again, you can see here, they start with a simple everyday description, then they do an interpretation, again, a description, a technical interpretation, and then an appraisal with a generic justification, which we haven't spoken about, but that was how I analyzed and broke those up into their parts. All right, let's go forward. Okay, so here let's have a quick look at the range of semantic density in first and fourth year noticings. And I think this is really quite interesting to note that, again, in first year, you see a far smaller number of students who can get to that more complex level of really digging into the theory and applying their knowledge base when they're interpreting or describing and appraising, 76% of first years. And then by the time they reach fourth year, 41%. So roughly, if you think about it, roughly 70% of students are in fourth year are able to enact a larger range of semantic density. So getting to that ST plus and ST plus plus. And I'll talk a little bit about the implications there, because that does mean that 30% of graduates are possibly not able to get, to enact that level of complexity. And what does that mean when they go into the world of work? Okay. All right. So then what I did, let's have a look. What does one's training enable a pre-service teacher to see or do differently? So this is a composite analysis of all facets of word recognition noticings. And I had to plot this on the Cartesian plane, or on the semantic plane. And this really, for me, showed me where the shifts were. And so we can see there are, do I need to go through the codes and explain them? Perhaps that would be good. What do you think,
You can
Carl?
gloss them each time you mention them. So like the best thing to do is to when you mention it, it's like, this is something I do anyway in talks, is that just as an aside, people, by the way, if you ever do an LCT talk to non-LCT people, it's even LCT people, don't just do it like you're writing something where you define things at the start. I'm not saying you'll do this, Lindy. I'm just telling this to everybody. Don't define things at the start and then expect everyone to remember them like 3/4 of an hour later. I've heard that sort of talk, or 20 minutes later. So it's really worth always glossing everything, like worldly code. That's where it's, very concrete and complex, blah, blah, blah. It's always worth glossing when you're talking over and over again, because you're kind of doing this sort of tacit pedagogy, as it were, to drill it into people's heads.
Okay,
So
all right,
gloss
great.
away.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
Okay,
David's asked a question, by the way.
Yeah, as a non-LCT person, could you quickly gloss translation for me? It sounds Bernsteinian. For me and Maria, we're both not LCT people.
Okay, so you want me to go into and explain the...
Oh, I can do this. I think I can do this for you, Lindsay.
Go.
Which is a translation device is the name in LCT given to what used to be called the very long name of external language of description. Except Basil never gave really any examples of the damn thing. But in LCT, it's usually a table that has the continuum of the organizing principle on the left. Do you want to go back to yours, Lindy, for a moment?
I was just thinking maybe it would be a good idea
on the left, and then the number of strengths that you're identifying in the next thing, and then some sort of usually indicators, a third, and then examples from the data. So you can translate between the organizing principle, like semantic gravity or semantic density, and then you can see, oh, right, they've divided up into 4 strengths. These are the indicators for each one. Look, some examples from the data. And then you can translate back and forward between the abstract category and the concrete data. And other people can, the reader can see why you've coded it this way rather than that way. So as Basil said, this would give us making it much more explicit rather than the rather vague sort of thing you get in a lot of other approaches where you're not really sure what something means, and you have to kind of hermeneutically interpret what's going on. So that's what it is, a translation device. And then somebody else can take it and adapt it for their own object of study. Though usually this is called a specific translation device because it's specific to this set of data and this topic and this object of study and so on. But often you can use this as a starting point for others. And there's another kind of translation device called a generic translation device, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. So does that answer your question, David?
Sorry, yes, it's a translation. It's an external language of description. That's the Bernsteinian connection. And then it refers to the variables that you've laid out in this chart. Yeah.
I just got rid of that incredibly long, rather awful name, and then actually made it, turned it into something that was actually you could see and use and have a model of. So
yes, good move. Thank you.
Yeah, external language description is too long. That's enough for me. Lindy, keep going. Yes.
Oh, thank you, Carl. I really appreciate that you stepped in. That's great. And I hope that helped. And just to say, was it David? I think one of the journeys that one goes on when you use LCT and you start working with a translation device is, I think I said this in the beginning, is that you constantly tightening it and improving it. So you start off with something that you think you're seeing in your data. And then as you're coding and using these indicators, you start to tighten it up and it starts to speak more and more to your data, or, backwards and forwards. And it's actually it's a really involved and very rewarding process, which takes a very long time sometimes. Okay. All right. So
it takes until you run out of time, really. It takes until
exactly. You can always get it. It's like a thesis can always be improved, I think, can't it? So so I agree with you, Carl, is that you could always do more with the translation device. So semantic gravity and semantic density can be used independently of each other. But I want to see the differences between the differences in the complexity and context dependence. And so how I did that was I plotted the strengths of semantic gravity and the strengths of semantic density on a semantic plane. Okay. So, and I mean, this is something that I had to kind of, the more I work with it and the more I read it and understand it, the better I get at speaking about it. So, but as you can see, these are all the word recognition noticing. So where I was talking to, I think it was Daniel, where I was saying to Daniel that I'd broken them down into description, interpretation, and appraisal. But this is all of that together. Okay, so this is everything as a whole. And I wanted to see the shift. So as you can see here, in first year, most of the noticings that I coded fell within the prosaic code. And the prosaic code is more context dependent with simpler meanings. So in other words, it's very much tied to the context of the lesson. And at the same time, they're not bringing their knowledge to bear on what's happening in the classroom, which is probably because they haven't had much time to develop a knowledge base. And now we need to see, you know, after 4 years of hopefully robust input from your studies, how does that shift? And yeah, so, and we can see here in the in final year noticings, there has been quite a significant shift. So the rhizomatic here refers to less context dependent and more complex. So it would be sort of talking about theory without relating it back to what they were seeing in the classroom, which is also valuable. But the worldly code here is particularly, I think, useful in that when a student enacts codes in the worldly, or when they're operating within the worldly code, should I say, they are taking their theory and their knowledge base, and they're using that to work with how they understand practice. So we can see quite a significant shift, but I didn't want to leave it there. I wanted to go deeper, and I wanted to know more about where these shifts were happening, in which facet of noticing that was happening. So I took a deeper look. Okay, why does this not look right? Okay, so this is just another way of looking at the Cartesian plane, the semantic plane. I haven't talked about the rarefied code here, tips and rules.
Sorry, Lindy, just press the enter one more time.
There you go.
Oh yes, excellent, thank you.
I was just about to say that is definitely nothing to do with me when it had like theoretical professional stuff, but now it is. There you
go. Okay. All right, but I actually think I'm going to move on so that I can actually speak to what's happening on the plane. Let me move forward. Let me do this. Hang on. Okay, all right. So let's look at each facet of noticing separately. We can see that for describing practice, both sets fall into the prosaic code the most. And I think that kind of makes sense in a way, because that's very much tied to the context of what's happening. But there is a shift between first and final year. There is a shift in terms of being able to, especially here in the worldly code, especially in terms of being able to bring your knowledge to bear on what's happening in the classroom. And then let's go forward. Interpretation is particularly interesting because in its nature, in interpretation's nature itself, it's more complex. You really have to look at the why. So even within first year, a lot more students are operating within the worldly code than they were in describing practice. And here we can see that a lot of students in their final year were falling within the rhizomatic and the worldly code, which I found very interesting. I'm trying to think of whether it's useful to give you an example. Okay, no, I don't think so. Let me not go into all my examples because I don't think there'll be time for that. All right. And interestingly, appraising the lesson in terms of being able to see what worked and what didn't work and giving possibilities for improvement was something that neither first nor final year students did a lot of. So I think maybe 10% of their overall noticings fell into appraisals, which for me is very interesting as a teacher educator. But we can see a shift between first year and final year here. And a lot more of these noticings fall into the rhizomatic code, where it's not context dependent. So weaker semantic gravity and stronger semantic density. So let's just have a look. Is there anyone who wants to make any comments about these? Because I always find it interesting what other people are noticing about these. No pressure. But
I've just got another question. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, please, 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 David. I hope I can answer your question.
So what are the units that you're looking at? Are they clauses? Are they paragraphs? Are they sentences or what?
I wonder if I should go back. I wonder if I should. Okay, so let me go back to the slide on that. I didn't include an example of an entire lesson observation report before analysis. But if you can think of this, imagine that there are no colors or breaks here. So this would be one lesson observation report in its entirety. Okay. So what I did from there is, I don't know if I'm actually focusing on what you want to know. I hope I am. Is I drew out the focus that I wanted to concentrate on, which was word recognition. So anything that I felt was related to word recognition, I pulled that out. Then from there, I coded for semantic gravity. And then I think I did the other way around, in fact. I first coded for semantic density, and then I coded for semantic gravity. I don't know if that helps you.
And
the units for coding are about
no, there are no units for coding. So it's wherever it changes.
So
okay.
Basically,
so that makes
basically
sense.
Thematic changes are the units for coding.
Yeah, so we don't divide up, say, for example, written text into some sort of unit from language, and then analyze those. It's so
it's where the change happens.
Codes don't always obey grammar or whatever.
Yeah, thematic changes is what you're coding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Ola also had that's a good question. Thanks, David. Ola, also, I think you were saying something as well. Thanks, people, for engaging.
Okay, let me go
really
back.
Great.
Sorry, Ola, I need to just go back. But anyway, carry on, Ola. Please carry on.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Lindy. Thanks, Lindy, for a great presentation so far. Can you just comment on the lack of codes in the rarefied quadrant, even when moving from first year to final year? Was this a surprise, and why would you not see it as you progress through the years?
I think it may also have to do with the context of the fact that I'm dealing with a lesson observation, which in itself is a very contextual thing to analyze. So in other words, what I would want to see, but I mean, this may be a preference of mine, is that, what are they doing in this lesson, and how do I apply my theoretical knowledge to that? And because that was part of the requirement of the lesson observation report, was that you take what you see, which is more context dependent, and you then bring your theoretical knowledge into that. I think that is why we are seeing less in the rhizomatic, because they have in fact been asked to understand and interpret and things like that. What are they interpreting? A particular lesson in a particular space and time. So I don't know if Lee wants to comment on that further, perhaps as a teacher educator as well. But I think it might be because we are not just speaking about a particular concept, but we are speaking about an actual lesson, which makes it inherently more context dependent. Does that make sense?
That's great.
I think I would agree with that. That they did draw on their theory, which took them into the rhizomatic, but very rarely just made sort of generalized, simple general. It seems that their kind of their signature pathways across the semantic plane were generally prosaic, rhizomatic, worldly between those codes. So I think it is the fact that we gave them a context to focus on.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, that we gave them a context. So perhaps if we were sitting with some students and discussing the implications of, say, phonemic awareness or phonological awareness, that would be far more what we'd like to see, far more of the rhizomatic in a conversation like that, where you haven't actually brought a context in. to the conversation.
I think you mean rarefied.
I mean
rarefied. Yeah.
Rarefied. Sorry. Yes. No, because I want to see complexity as well, though. So wouldn't rarefied be not complex?
Yeah, the rarefied is abstract.
Yes, but rhizomatic is what I would want to see if I was talking about a concept like
context. Yeah. I was just interested that you didn't see any at all, any of the coding in the rarefied, but you've explained
very
why.
little. You're quite right. Very little. Yeah.
I just wanted to add in. I think what's the most significant thing here is in those two planes is that you've seen a shift right and up, mostly towards the right.
Yeah.
So you've got a shift rightwards, which is just more complexity basically, and a little bit up, so slightly more abstract, but mostly they've got more complex from first to final year as a whole.
Yeah, which is what you want to see. You want to see.
You'd hope. Yeah.
We would hope, exactly. We would hope.
Can I just?
Oh yes, please. Sorry, please. Who was there?
So it's Paul Curzon.
Hi, Paul.
So I think I've seen sort of similar patterns with my MSc students, so in computer science, and I wonder if some of the reasons are the same. But one of the things it sort of made me think is they don't understand the importance of theory, it seems, to realize even that they're supposed to be using it, and that was something that they were learning, or maybe some of it goes over their head, and so they don't understand it, so they don't use it. But there's also feels like perhaps it's just they don't understand it's important, and kind of see the task as you are just describing the lesson, not that you're linking it to theory. And I kind of get the impression with my students that they really just don't understand that the theory is important, and they think the task is just to apply their brilliant common sense reasoning that shows how brilliant they are in their ability to quote analyze, where what that means is just say what they see in a common sense way. And with teachers, presumably potentially they're linking it to what matters to them is what they do in the classroom, which is what you would perhaps see kind of staying down. It's all that kind of context rather than abstract. I don't know, but I'm sort of talking in circles. But one of the things I was wondering is did anybody ever model exactly this task to them to show them over and over again what good tasks and good answers would look like that were actually kind of using all four of the quadrants and definitely going up into the rhizomatic? Because the thing that Carl said, or Lee, somebody said the really obvious thing is it's very few of them, less than half are actually going anywhere much at all. So a large number kind of haven't got even what the task is, or if they have got what it is, they're incapable of doing it. But I suspect if it's like my students, they don't get that that's what they were expected to do in the first place. I just wondered, have they seen?
I think what you're saying is so important. And I think, Lee, but please correct me if I'm wrong, Lee, I think you've done a study on making explicit in rubrics, kind of making things explicit, the expectations for students. I don't know about, Lee might be able to tell us, but I'm not sure about what was modeled to them during teacher choices. But I know that since the module was developed, there's been some work on how to make expectations for lesson observation reports more explicit, which I think is really, really important. And it's actually one of the recommendations in my study is that we spend a whole lot more time. I'm just going to go there because I did put it down somewhere. Is that there's this disconnect between theory and practice, and that we need more structured opportunities for analysis and discussion so that it can be, modeled to students who don't see perhaps the value or how to make those connections in meaningful ways. I think that's really, really an important point you make. Because what are we expecting? Are we expecting them to do it in a vacuum where they don't they know the theory, they understand what's happening, but they just don't know how to bring those together. And I also
Lindy,
think that
let me come in here.
Oh, please do.
Thanks. So just to go back to what Paul was asking about. So if you just go to those plain comparisons again, Lindy.
These ones.
Yeah.
Which
so
one?
Start with the describing.
Okay.
So here we see that the fourth years can really describe what the teachers are doing very, very precisely. And that was really pleasing. There's a huge shift there. And this is across 3 universities. And then go to the interpreting one. Again, I mean, they've doubled their visits to the worldly code, and their prosaic is far, far less. And I think that there's lots of shifting. This is what the teacher's doing, and this is what I think it means. And they're bringing in theory a little bit, quite a lot more. So again, they're pleasing shifts there, but the appraisal shifts, what could the teacher be doing that they're not doing, going to the appraisal? We're not seeing very much there. And this is crucial in a country where the literacy rates are so low. They've got to be able to see possibilities. So what we're going to do as a result of Lindy's findings here, we are going to do modifications onto the teacher choices in action and just making those much more explicit, the expectations. And kind of pushing them into that direction a little bit more, I think explicitly. But this is one of the findings that we're going to now feed back into the module.
I mean, the sort of thing that I think I would be trying to do, well, one thing is make it more explicit what's expected, but also put in some feedback loops where you do get them to do a task like this, having first given them, here's an example of what a really good one looks like, get them to do it, give them feedback on what's missing, possibly even in terms of some sort of visualization like this kind of thing, and then get them to do it again, and then see where they are after they've done it within that kind of feedback loop. So is that the kind of thing you're thinking about? Because I mean, I'm thinking about this partly because I think I'm about to go into an argument in our place about them changing the way assessment's done, where they're wanting to cut assessment so that you just do things once. They've got this new rule: you can only ever test a learning outcome once because it's a waste of time to test it twice. And so they're cutting out assessment, and they're cutting out these sort of staging loops that are there to actually train people into, so that it's not a surprise. And one of the things I've always had a principle is I shouldn't be giving people surprises. If I'm setting somebody some kind of, whether it's assessment or otherwise, I ought to have sort of given them a chance to learn explicitly. It's not I'm trying to be clever doing something and they're supposed to guess what's intended or work it out from my description of my marking guidelines or the learning outcomes or whatever. It's actually they've done it, and they seem to be wanting to just strip all of that out in my place because you can only test things once. But it's just sort of my random trying to compare this with my situation because it's really interesting. But yeah. Anyway, sorry, I'm going to have to go very soon, by the way, so I'll disappear.
Keep going, Lindy.
Really interesting, and I'm sorry, I'm going to leave before you finish.
Paul, I think it's great. This is why we're here, to talk about how all of this can apply across, and how we can make it useful and yeah. So okay. So now that we've kind of looked at the shifts, and there are shifts, which I think was really encouraging to see that. And if we hadn't seen shifts, then we would have been very worried. So really, we have, as Carl says, there's this trend towards a more complex way of seeing and understanding teaching, and that 70% of the students that I you know, in my participants, 70% of them were able to recruit insights from coursework, so work within SD plus, a larger semantic range, and therefore they had better capacity for knowledge building. But I still remain concerned about the 30% that couldn't, that couldn't see complexity in practice or articulate how theory related at fourth year level. And so my thought is that one needs to think about how we can stop these students from falling through the cracks, and how we can teach teachers differently and better, as you were saying, Paul, and be more explicit about how theory connects to practice. And then, I mean, something that's not explicitly related to my LCT analysis, but in my study, is the fact that students on both sides, the fourth and the first year, struggled to identify strengths and weaknesses. So it was not something they were comfortable doing to appraise the lesson. And I think, as I've said before, your critical sensibilities, your ability to look at something and say, this is, it was not perhaps the best way of doing something, and here's a suggestion for improvement, I think is quite important in the teaching world in terms of preparing students to critique their own practice as well. We want teachers to be reflexive when they start teaching, and you try something in your classroom and then you reflect. And why did it work, or why did it not work? If it did work, what were the elements that I can share with my colleagues or use again in my next lesson? I think that's all very important. And then I think for teacher educators, I think I've said this already, but just to spend more time on the why of practice, the reasoning behind teacher choices, which I think is something that Lee was trying to do and is trying to do in the teacher choices in action module. So yes, thank you very much for your time. It was really lovely to be able to present, and I remember my first roundtable that I attended, and it was the beginning of my journey with LCT, and I never imagined that I would ever be able to present anything. So I really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
That means we've got loads of time to discuss. So let's discuss. Let's jump in and ask lots of questions. We already started that. So
I've got a question from Maria. She wants to know more about rules. I assume that you're talking about realization rules. Is that correct?
No.
No? Okay.
So firstly, I would never use the word rules, because you just go and read some Bourdieu and find out why you're going to get slammed for that. The model of autonomy, it's a thing Basil got kicked for treating people like they're automatons when he didn't, but the word rules is just asking for kicking. But no, it's just a word. How did you use it, Lindy? Because I don't think you were using it for that. How did you use the word rules?
No, I didn't use the word rules much at all. I think I brought in Bernstein's realization rules and recognition rules in my literature review a little bit.
I find realization and recognition really handy as a distinction. So, students being able to see what success might be based upon, or anybody being able to see what success or achievement might be based upon in a social arena. But then can they actually also realize, can they actually do that action or that performance or that code or whatever? And there is a real difference. You can sometimes see what you need to do, but feel cut off from the capacity to be able to do it, which is extraordinarily stressful, or be able to do it without even noticing that you're recognizing it, perhaps. But I find that distinction really, really valuable. But I don't know if Lindy used the word rule anywhere. Did you? No, you didn't.
So I didn't, but I did. What I've done is in my study is I've elaborated on the idea of pedagogical noticing, so the ability to see into practice and how that would impact on your ability to apply. So the rules of recognition and then realization and the link there. I don't know if that connects to what you were saying.
Okay, thanks. Can you go back to the slide where you had the big wave that went up to
semantic
skill of decoding and the learners, and so no, it's the blue wave. I think it was the blue wave where the
wave that I wanted it to look really cool, and then it didn't do it.
Yeah, that was it.
That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the units are, as I understand it, changes in theme, and you're not being distracted by the vocabulary. So, for example, in Unit 1, there's the word strategy, which to me is quite an abstract word, but the learners is obviously very concrete. It's the learners in the room. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And then, but then SD++ in Unit 4, you've got, again, the learners in the room, which is very concrete. But then you've got skills of decoding. Now, so why do you
I can hear where you're coming from so clearly, and I think this is a good conversation to have. So and what you can do with LCT and with a translation device, if you so wish to, is you can choose to analyze data sentence by sentence, which I think would be kind of how you are looking at it. Maybe I'm wrong. So,
you're
like,
exactly
for example,
right.
I think okay. So I mean, that could have just been a different strategy of mine if I so wanted to, but I was looking at a chunk of interpretation there. So because I had separated the noticing or the observation into the different facets of noticing, so description, interpretation, and appraisal. When I saw it changing, I took that chunk and I analyzed that particular chunk. But you're not wrong in saying that, you know, if you go deeper or more granular, if you like, you could say that within that statement, there are different levels of complexity within itself. If I want to, I think, Carl, am I hitting it there with how you can do it?
I think the word strategy is an interesting one because it's so contextual in the sense of it's so like, what's a complex term in terms of how much condensation there's been? It really does depend, doesn't it? Like if you take strengths and weaknesses or whatever, if I saw those words, I wouldn't normally think of them as being highly technical, but in business studies, it's part of the SWOT model. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats.
Yeah.
And then suddenly that is actually a word in which there is quite a lot of complexity. Whereas in other contexts, you might say, you know, like weakness or something, it has, you know, much less complexity to it. But yeah, so it is very much something you have to interpret in each kind of area or in each study you're doing, because words don't have a fixed semantic density at all. If they did, we wouldn't teach, would we? We wouldn't be packing them up and unpacking them and so on. But strategy is an interesting one. But you're also, the question is really interesting because it does, as you were saying, it reflects on the fractal capacity of these concepts. You can use them to analyze an entire education system, or you can use them to analyze individual words, as we've done with a generic translation device that we're trying to automate at the moment, which goes right down to the individual word level of semantic density. So you can use it at different levels, as long as it makes, I mean, the purpose really is, does it help make an explanation? That's all, really. It's not a model of anything. It's just, does it help you explain something, such as, you know, we're seeing this movement from here to here, and we'd like to get it over here instead. How can we do that? That would be my approach to it. It's like, you know, useful if it helps solve a problem. Anyone else? Jump in, please.
I just want to come in here. So when Lindy's doing this, here she's looking at semantic density. She's not looking at semantic gravity. So she's not looking at how abstract or generalized or concrete things are, but she is looking at how simple or complex they are in this particular wave. So I mean, here the strategy is very unspecified. It's, you know, Mrs. McGee is using a strategy. She's taking the learners through words that's seen in the book. You know, it's not a specific strategy. It's just kind of like she's doing some stuff. I think that was what we're thinking, as opposed to skills of decoding, which are very, very more precise.
Exactly.
But you know, we got to separate the context dependence, which is not being represented in this profile, from the complexity, the shifts in complexity.
Thanks, Lee.
I guess to me, it's the strategy there. It's clearly, Carl, it's clearly not from the SWOT model, although I would point out that the SWOT model does distinguish between future and past.
Sorry. I should clarify. I was only using that as an example from somewhere completely different, which is,
okay.
I was just saying, here's a word which in one context has low semantic density, but in another context has higher. I wasn't bringing in. So I was just saying, if you have the word strengths and weaknesses somewhere in a classroom, it may mean, or in a general conversation outside, it may mean nothing. And then you see it in an essay in business studies, it has a lot of semantic density.
Right. So, but what's germane here is the post-modifier of taking the learners through the words. That is often seen in the book. That's sort of two post-modifiers, one for the strategy and one for the words. And that seems to me to be, but again, you know, I'm slipping back into semantic gravity rather than density. Whereas skills of decoding seems to me completely decontextualized. That is to say, if you haven't read a lot of the literature, you don't really know what that refers to.
Yeah. So it's quite a specialized in this particular context of teaching reading. The skills of decoding is a very specific, very specialized, I would say, terminology that you would, you know, you have to kind of have a particular gaze on practice and be able to be able to apply that properly and appropriately, I would say.
Yeah.
But I mean, these are all discussions, and I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing you start and you attack your data and you go backwards and forwards to see what the data is telling you and how the translation device can be modified. So it's
also
really
another thing is that they're all just relative strengths, aren't they? So they're not locked. You know, if you were analyzing another set of data, say like abstracts or scientific research papers, you know, they would be operating at a very different level. And so, you know, you'd have to be careful about what weaker and stronger means there. You wouldn't get any of the really weak stuff. It'd be like solidly strong, but some more stronger than others in terms of SD anyway. But yeah, so you're just trying to say, I think this is stronger and this is weaker than these other things inside this data.
Yeah. Thanks,
Daniel.
So I was I know that Lindy, you kind of mentioned this. I think you said the sweet spot of SG plus and SD plus as far as your sort of pedagogical. But what importance would you put, and I think this may be something that Lee wrote a while ago, what importance would you attribute to actually getting the students to create waves within their observations? In other words, that we have them go up and down.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we want to see. I think, you know, what's been quite a journey for me in the way that I understand LCT and the codes and things, you know, initially, and you can ask Lee, I initially was hoping, everything would be complex by fourth year, you know, everything should be complex by fourth year, everything should be up there in SD plus or whatever. And Lee's kind of worked with me in understanding this whole thing of you need to see waves because you're bringing it back to context, and then you're making it understandable, and then you're making sense of it, and then you're bringing it. So I think it's really, really important to use. Hasn't semantic waving been used before, I think, Lee, in showing students how to analyze their own lesson observation reports? Am I wrong? I don't know. But I think you're right in saying that I think it's a really great tool. And probably you would find students are quite surprised once they analyze their own work to see, you know, wow, I've just flatlined here, like it's completely completely simple observations, and then to show, a bit of waving. I think it's really important. I hope I've responded appropriately there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Anybody got anything else, or we can end this roundtable? It's always great to have discussions like this.
Yes, I really appreciate it. It's very interesting for me as well.
No? Okay. Well, look, you can always contact Lindy or ask questions or make points on the email forum because, that's a way of reaching a lot of people around the world as well. And the LCT community is a nice one. People try to help each other, which is really good. Thank you so much, Lindy. This is the silent, usually this is now the silent clap of Zoom of, everyone doing this sort of like gesture, which is
everybody.
very unfulfilling in many ways, but they're, still heartfelt. It would be nice to hear that, wouldn't it, a bit more, but, no, thanks, Lindy, for taking us through that. And for me, it's always interesting to see concepts being used in various ways, always enacted in different ways, and the way in which they're being enacted in each of these specific studies can help us understand how they might have potential for other studies, or they may be very differently used in other studies, because the concepts themselves are really rather abstract. So one has to sort of, as you say, as you did, translate them down as best you can into an object of study to make sense of it, to try and generate an explanation, as you are trying to do. So are you writing this up, or when's this going in, or?
So I've already I've already been what do you call it? I've already got my results, and then I'm just making changes, and then everything will be finalized. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, I hope that we see some of this out in the world in published form at some point in the future as well.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, everybody. And I hope to see many of you here in 2 weeks' time, where, just bear with me for a second while I find it so you can get a quick sense of what might be coming up. It tries to fill the time with sound. We've got in 2 weeks, Rita is going to talk about lenses and cultivated gazes. Lenses is something we haven't really discussed much or used much. So part of gazes, cultivated gazes in education, in literary studies specifically. So a different part of LCT that will be coming from specialization. And a very different kind of topic as well. So I hope to see some of you for there, because the more times you see these concepts in action, the more you can understand them. Actually, the only really way of understanding them is to try using them, but it certainly helps to hear how other people have tried using them as well.